team. And I'm joined here by several of my colleagues, Laura Harmon, our project manager, as well as Tim Porter, our chief urban forester, and several of my other colleagues on the UDO team. Since we have a limited number from the public tonight, we thought it might be beneficial to kind of kick off. If you guys have just questions that you were wanting to ask, we could go ahead and start with those and then kind of go from there. We do have a presentation planned, but yeah, we'd love to hear from you guys if you have specific questions first. And feel free to just come off mute and ask those if you'd like.
I'm not sure if everyone can hear us, Mariah. I want to play something in the chat.
Let me see. All right. Okay, well, I think we could just, if there aren't any questions, we can go ahead and go into the presentation then, I suppose. Just share my screen. Can everyone see that okay? Good, okay, great. All right, so today we will be going through some of the key changes between the first and second draft of the UDO. We did have virtual update sessions on Tuesday where we covered key changes and answered questions from community members, and recordings of those are available on our website, charlotteudo.org. And then earlier today, like I said, we did cover the same topics we'll be going over tonight, and recording from that meeting will be going live soon as well. So just some quick meeting procedures. Like I said, we're joined by several UDO staff members who will narrate the topical portion of the presentation. And feel free to enter any comments or questions you have in the chat box along the way, and we'll try to kind of answer those in real time if we can. Yolanda, if you don't mind just kind of monitoring that, that would be super helpful. It's hard for me to see it under this sharing view. And then we will have time at the end to respond to questions as well as any that you submitted during registration. So for today's meeting, like I said, the second draft UDO, which is also referred to as the public hearing draft, was released for public consumption on June 3rd. The full red line of the second draft is available on our website. And today we will be reviewing the adoption timeline and key dates, as well as the public input process and schedule, and then the key changes from the first to the second draft, as well as the transition to the UDO. So our public comment portal opened on June 3rd alongside the release of the second draft, and we will be, we're in a public engagement period right now. So currently you are attending our virtual update sessions. We had some on Tuesday, like I said, and then yesterday, we had an open house at the government center, and then we will also be hosting virtual office hours beginning next week. And you can find the signups for those on our website, and you can sign up to talk to a staff member about the topic of your choosing. And then in terms of public comments, those submitted in our portal will be reviewed by staff and packaged and sent along to Planning Committee and City Council for their review. And then this here shows our project timeline. I'm not going to go over the engagement dates again, but if you look towards the latter half, you'll see some keystone dates that we have coming up. So on July 11th, we will have a public hearing with the City Council on the second draft of the UDO. And then on July 19th, the team will be seeking a recommendation on the UDO from the Planning Committee. And that's followed by an anticipated City Council decision on August 22nd. And then just to put the project in context, we've basically been working on the second draft of the UDO since the first draft was released in October. And the inputs for the second draft have included over 1,200 comments from community members and stakeholders, City Council and Planning Commission feedback, as well as our UDO Advisory Commission review and feedback, and then internal comments, a number of those from city and county staff. And then just that point there at the bottom, the second draft does build off of the first draft, but it includes some new and updated concepts and approaches that are important for community review. And then when you do dig into the red line, if you haven't already, just a quick note about how the draft works. So there are text markups that illustrate where items have been added, and those are shown in blue underline. And then where they have been removed are shown in red strike through. And then there are a number of editor's notes just to provide some more clarity and context around the changes made between the first and second draft. With that, we will move to the more substantive portion of our presentation. Tim Porter will kick us off with the discussion of key changes for trees in the second draft UDO, and then Laura Harmon will speak to several other impactful areas shown here. So Tim.
Thanks, Mariah. Good evening, everyone. The majority of the significant changes from draft 1 to draft 2 in the tree world are almost completely a heritage tree related item, but there is another important change we want to highlight, and that is the shifting of tree protection standards into Article 20. So this is an effort to move all vegetation related requirements into one location, specifically to trees. There was Article 29, the first draft, that is being done away with, and all those tree protection, preservation, and planting requirements will continue to exist, but they'll be shifted into Article 20 alongside landscape and screening regulations, primarily an effort to streamline and provide a little bit better quality customer service for all of our customers, along with a little bit ease of use for staff as well. So we wanted to highlight that. And at this point, I think we can move on to the heritage tree component on the next slide. Thank you. The heritage tree regulation has been by far the most prominent and controversial tree regulation. And what we have decided to recommend to council is to take a dual approach and split this regulation into 2 applications. That's primarily to find a better balance between preservation intent, mitigation intent, and tracking. There's a sense to learn more about how regulating this type of large mature tree, this heritage tree across the city, will impact property owners, and also we need to have a better understanding of how much heritage trees mean to Charlotte's tree canopy. We heard from council, we heard from the public, and we also got some really eye-opening results from our economic impact analysis that said in the first draft, the proposed heritage tree regulation really would have significantly restricted and in some cases prevented development. So we knew that was not the right balance. So the 2 key changes from the first draft to the second draft are splitting up this requirement into 2 application areas. The non-land development requirement, or the homeowner decisions part of the ordinance concept, will be a blanket protection that will actually live in the standalone Charlotte tree ordinance, because technically it's not a development requirement. And the second change area, the land development side of this regulation, that of course will be located in the UDO, and that has been adjusted to provide more flexibility and predictability for customers. Both of these requirements, or excuse me, both of these applications will have a requirement to obtain a permit and mitigation, and we'll talk more about that in the next couple slides. So I think we can move on to the next slide. Thank you. This table shows where are we now on the left column. what we proposed in the first draft and what we're proposing now in the second draft. So right now we don't really have any type of, we do have something on the books, but it really is not doing much at all as far as preserving trees. We don't protect many trees at all. We average less than one heritage tree protected per year. In the first draft, based on our canopy analysis, knowing that our canopy is declining significantly, hearing a lot of feedback supporting a heritage tree requirement, we proposed a very strong preservation focused requirement that really did not allow removal of heritage trees unless they were hazardous, dead, dying, or diseased, or very significant property restrictions for development or property use. There was a mitigation requirement, but it was a very strongly focused preservation intent. And in the second draft, to find that better balance, we are shifting to a more moderate preservation intent, where removal will be allowed if there's a demonstrated conflict. So development customers would have to demonstrate a conflict on a site. They would be allowed to develop the entire footprint as long as other requirements are met. And we are emphasizing a stronger mitigation requirement to ensure there's sustainable replenishing of the canopy moving forward. A mitigation fee of $1,500 per tree removed and one tree minimum replanted. That fee can be reduced or eliminated if additional trees are planted. Each additional tree credits back $250 towards reducing that fee. Preservation of other trees, such as specimen trees, which is the next class down, large trees, 20 to 30 inches, not quite the massive heritage tree type, but preservation of those existing trees on a developing site would allow, would meet the full mitigation requirement. We're also proposing, if you go back, proposing that preservation of a heritage tree would give double credit for that tree's canopy area towards meeting any applicable green area requirements, such as tree safe, and continuing forward, the ability to remove any diseased or hazardous tree without a permit, without mitigation. The next slide talks about the non-land development side of this regulation. Right now, we don't have anything. And this is important to note that this is not technically a development requirement. This is a blanket protection that would apply to all properties within the city limits. The first draft proposed approach was the same for this and land development. In the second draft, as we kind of split that in two, even more relaxed preservation intent. So removal would be allowed in all cases. A permit would be required unless, again, diseased or hazardous or declining. The mitigation requirements are a little bit less than development. It's $500 a tree, one tree replanted. Each additional tree can reduce that fee to $250. By $250 up to total removal of the mitigation fee. And again, that requirement will live in the standalone tree ordinance. And that's all the slides that I have. Happy to take any questions now or later on, and appreciate everyone's time.
So Tim, it looks like you do have one question in the chat. Patricia Campbell asked or states, it seems you slacken developer restrictions concerning trees.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely relax them. What we found is that what was proposed in the first draft really restricted development significantly. In some cases, the analysis that our consultants provided found that it prevented development in some cases. So we felt that that was a step too far. Right now, if we could go back one slide to that table for the land development applicability, thank you. What we have now on the far left, currently in the tree ordinance, is like a 1 on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the strongest preservation approach. That's not good enough. What we proposed in the first draft is like an 8 or a 9, and so we think we went a little bit too far down that scale. And so we're pivoting back to, like a 5 right now. So we definitely have relaxed from the first draft, but we also need to conduct some additional analysis, we feel, to get a better granular understanding of how this type of requirement will impact developers and property owners. Also, we're planning on studying heritage trees to understand their contribution and importance to the canopy. UNCC did a study in one neighborhood, Revolution Park, that found that, which has very high tree canopy coverage, found that that neighborhood, its total tree population, heritage trees were only about 30% of all the trees in that neighborhood. However, they accounted for 60 to 65% of all the benefits that those trees provided, which is very telling. So we want to learn more about that and come back, in 18 months, 24 months with a better understanding to see if it makes sense to recommend to council a stronger preservation approach, similar to something like in the first draft version. I also wanted to mention that the fees that are collected will be put into a new canopy care program intended to help residents maintain large trees on private property, particularly in underserved areas, and also for tree planting on those properties. So while the preservation intent definitely has been, reduced, there's a stronger planting and sustainability approach with the mitigation requirements. So thank you for the question and then the statement.
You have one additional question. Patricia writes, FENCO, F-E-N-C-O, I'm just gonna read it out. Our area is being developed and trees are being removed. Can you add our area to your study? Again, that's FENCO.
Possibly, we haven't fully defined the scope of the study, but we want it to be a broad study looking at different types of neighborhoods, demographics, land use. So absolutely, we can consider it. I appreciate that recommendation. We want to learn more about where these trees are and what type of impact they have to property owner decisions, and just environmentally how important they are. So yeah, I would love to look into that, and I appreciate you offering that up.
Any other questions on trees? Otherwise, I think we can go to the next part of the presentation.
Not seeing anything come through, Laura, so we'll move on.
So I'm going to take you through the remainder of the changes that we had scheduled for this evening's presentation. Some of the major changes that we've made, and we covered some of those also during our Tuesday meetings, which you can go back and watch the recordings for those if you're interested. So one of the things that we have done in this draft is work with Mecklenburg County Park and Recreation to have a greater incorporation of park and rec elements in the draft. What we realized, we had an opportunity to add the option for people to dedicate land to Mecklenburg County Park and Recreation or provide a fee in many cases instead of providing on-site open space. And as we tested this just briefly with some folks in the development community, they were really interested in that option. There could be cases where it might be better to either hand over the land to Park and Rec and let them use it as park land so that the development wouldn't have to maintain it, or to provide a fee in lieu. And then those fees could be gathered and parks that serve multiple properties could be developed. So a change that we made relatively late in the process, but we think it's a great opportunity for Park and Rec land. So next slide. Another thing that we heard a lot about was there are different types of open areas and can these overlap? So we have gone back into the draft and identified where you can overlap. For example, your open space requirement and your amenitized tree area can overlap as long as you can meet the objectives of both of those types of areas. So we've identified when you can overlap, and then there's some places where you can't really meet both of the objectives. We didn't give an opportunity to overlap. Next slide. Electric vehicle charging stations. So we were pretty aggressive with our first proposal, and we got some feedback about the cost of something called EV Ready. We have EV Capable, we had EV Ready and EV Install. And what we heard back and realized is that EV Ready is something that is fairly expensive to provide, but does not provide benefit because it's not all the way installed. So we took out EV Ready as a requirement for certain uses such as multifamily and hotels, parking lots, kept EV Capable and EV Install, adjusted the definition for EV Capable to be more consistent with what's actually being provided. And also want to point out that there is a Duke Energy program that helps to defray cost associated with electric vehicle charging stations. And we've also added a height bonus for people who want to go to a certain level above and beyond what is required. And this is the kind of standard that as the market evolves and the needs evolve in our community, we will be adjusting over time. Parking is another area where we have made some tweaks. We had a lot of conversation, particularly with our city council. And frankly, when in the community and with city council, there doesn't seem to be a clear consensus on what we should be doing with parking right now. There are some communities who have eliminated all parking minimums. We did hear back from council that we're really probably not ready to do that, but we have a 3-tiered system where you have the most parking in areas where we think the demand is going to be strongest, the auto-oriented areas, and the least amount of parking in the tier that is, say, around transit stations or uptown, where actually in most cases you don't even have a parking requirement, and you might have a parking maximum. So we maintain that tier system. We have consolidated some the standards to try to make it simpler to go through, though it's still fairly detailed. The parking minimums in the tier 1, which is the most auto intensive area, have been generally have been reduced somewhat. The parking minimums for residential uses in tier 1, as opposed to the non-residential, the residential have only very minor changes. Next slide. The middle tier, we have also reduced the parking minimums for non-residential uses in most cases. We've also made changes to the parking, to adding, well, not adding, we had some parking minimum requirements for select uses like restaurants and bars and multifamily in tier 3, which is like, for example, where our transit station areas are. But we did have a requirement that if you're within 200 feet of a neighborhood 1 place type, certain uses would have a parking minimum. And we've increased that distance to 400 feet after feedback that we've received, particularly from council. And then finally, we added a provision that says that any development within a half a mile of an existing rapid transit station, so that would be a light rail station, can use the tier 3 parking standards. So that means in most cases, they're not going to have a parking minimum and would have a parking maximum. They can use those even if their zoning district does not fall under that tier. But that's as long as the development is not located in what we're calling our neighborhood 1 place type or our traditional neighborhoods. Next slide. Industrial block link, something else we heard some conversation about is that as development is evolving, and some of these, particularly warehousing uses, are getting bigger, that the block lengths that we had proposed were not adequate to allow them to be built. So we did increase the maximum block length to 2,000 feet from 1,500. And we did add a flexibility provision that allows the block length, maximum block length, to be greater than 2,000, longer than 2,000, if there's a specific need to accommodate a building that is longer than that. Next slide. We did add standards for Uptown. This was something we had overlooked in the first draft, but we do have 4 new street classifications for Uptown, and these are shown on the Charlotte Streets map and are referred to in the ordinance. Next slide. And then we added a chapter on non-conforming site elements to provide some more clarity. And these site elements are things like landscaping, fencing and walls, parking and loading, and to provide the clarity on when those need to be replaced or brought into conformance and when they can remain. And typically they can remain in place in all situations except for construction of a new principal building. And there are probably some exceptions in the ordinance, but that's typically the way this is worked out.
So we have a question in the chat from Patricia Campbell. For developers building multi-units, somewhat confused, can provide clarity for non-resident parking. And Patricia, if you're able to come off mute and provide and ask your question, you're welcome to do so as well.
Hello. The reason I'm asking is because I'm in the Finco area. And I understand that it's going to cover a broader area, but when we're talking to developers and they're providing parking for their residents, we're running into the problem that they're not providing parking for visitors. So is there somewhere in the the UDO that gives a guideline that they should require parking for visitors? Because a lot of it, and if you're not familiar with the Finco area, I call us the last of the real Charlotte, with the country part with the 2-lane roads where the horses used to ride down the street. So we are having a lot of developers come over here and they're building the townhomes, but they're not providing parking for their visitors. So is there anywhere in the UDO that's giving guidelines of how much visitor parking space is needed, or is that just too deep, or am I being too anal retentive for space?
Arista, are you still on? Arista is our consultant with Camiras, and I was going to ask if you could talk about that a little bit and what you've seen in other communities as well.
Yes, I am still here. Let me turn on my camera so that I am not rude. So yes, we have seen standards in other places that do look at things like multifamily or townhouse, where you have these larger developments that do require some level of visitor parking. However, we don't really frequently see them in larger cities like Charlotte. And so in the current draft of the UDO, the second draft, we don't have requirements for visitor parking. But I do understand your concern. We have seen other places, again, slightly smaller cities that are doing it, that are incorporating that as well.
Thank you.
Any other questions before we move to the end of the presentation?
I don't have any.
Thank you. Okay, we'll go to we're getting near the end and just kind of hit these next slides kind of at a high level. There are some procedural changes that will be occurring with the UDO, as well as some zoning changes. So first, wanted to indicate that we recommend that the UDO take effect approximately 9 months after adoption. And that would, the date we're proposing is June 1st of 2023. And until then, our current regulations would remain in place. And at that point in time, all conventional zoning that doesn't have a site plan associated with it, would translate to one of the new zoning districts in the UDO. Our conditional zoning would not change at that point in time, though we would consider in the longer term possible staff-initiated rezonings for conditional zoning to one of the new UDO districts to be aligned with the community area plans that will be started in the fall of this year. And there will be extensive community engagement, both with the community area planning process and any alignment rezoning that we would go through. Next slide. Just for conventional rezonings, that if there are rezonings that are pending on the effective date, that the requested zoning district would be changed to the district that they would translate to. So for example, if someone came in for a B1, a business request, at the effective date, their request would change to a general commercial or CG request. And you could begin filing a conventional rezoning 3 months before the effective date, though processing wouldn't begin until the effective date. And we will, with conventional rezonings, be having community meetings, which is something new in the UDO. Next slide. For conditional rezonings, any conditional request that is filed 4 months or more before the effective date would be able to move forward under the current regulations, even if the decision is after the effective date, as long as that decision is made within 9 months after the effective date. And we would begin accepting conditional rezonings for the new zoning districts 4 months before the effective date. And again, processing would not begin until the effective date. Next slide. We have a couple of procedures through state law. The first is permit choice, which says that if you file an application for a permit and a regulation is changed before your approval, that you can move forward with either the old regulation or the newly approved regulation. You get to choose. And this works for all development activity, but not including rezonings. And if you have multiple permits that are required and you are in that permit choice time period, you, for the next 18 months, can choose for your later permits, either the old regulations or the new regulations. And then our final slide is on vesting or vested rights. This is again something established by state law, and there are different periods for vesting. And what vesting is says that you can move forward under the regulations that you were approved for the designated time period for the type of development activity that you have. And those rights become effective on the day of your approval. So you can see the different types of development we have. So if you come in for a development permit and you get approval and it's in advance of the UDO regulations, you have a year to use the regulations you were approved under. And there's also something called a common law vesting, where you've made a significant investment that also allows you to move forward under the current regulations. So that's pretty dry stuff, but some of the procedures that go along with the UDO. And I see that there's at least one question that has been added. And Ms. Campbell asked, for properties grandfathered in, but communities are growing, how will they be affected for parking and space for community activities? So you would have those two options for continuing on under the current regulations, but there will be a time period after which you would come in with a new development and have to meet the new regulations, or that we would be changing the zoning so that you would be required to. So there is somewhat of a grace period, but we hope to, as quickly as we can reasonably and legally move forward, we would like to bring new development under the new regulations, which we think will better align with the community values.
Okay, question. So then for the people that have horse ranches, how will they come into community guidelines?
It would depend on when they came in to develop. So, I mean, if they can continue doing what they're doing, if they have a horse ranch out there with no limitation, but at some point, typically what we see is those properties do come in for development. And depending on the timing of when they came in would determine what regulations they fall under. Typically anything that comes in after the UDO goes into effect, unless they have a conditional plan, would have to meet the standards of the Unified Development Ordinance.
So then I would need to make sure my conditional plan meets future UDO guidelines?
As a community member, well, you would not, as someone developing, they would be able to use the regulations that were in place when they were approved, or when they filed in some cases for conditional rezonings. But I would hope that the community would start, as they're negotiating with the development community on rezonings, would start looking towards what's in the UDO and asking for incorporation of those standards as new development comes in.
Okay, so I'll make sure I'm understanding. To make sure that my horse ranch is not pushed out from new development, what do I need to do then?
Nothing. If you own your horse ranch, then you just don't sell to someone wanting to develop it.
Okay, no, because the way you made it sound like I had to do something because I'm grandfathered in. So I wanted to make sure that, so as long as I can maintain my business and pay will my taxes increase because of the new development area?
Not necessarily if you are continuing to use that property in the same way. They really shouldn't, unless your zoning changes radically, but I would doubt that would happen in this case.
No, the reason I'm asking, because this is not where I'm at. I have a piece of property in the city, and before it was nothing there. So I did the horse races and everything, but now my community is changing and I have houses around. Whereas before they didn't push the law that you can't park on the grass, but since there are houses over there, the tow trucks, the city send tow trucks and everything, and it's affecting my business. So that's why I was wondering, is there a way that available parking could be set up somewhere, or do I need to buy some more land to try and maintain parking for when I do have my horse races and things?
Yeah, that would be you as the property owner, your responsibility. And I guess the caveat is uses that came in and that are compliant with the ordinance can continue on. So it sounds like maybe parking in the grass wasn't compliant, and that's why you're possibly hearing from folks. But no,
well, it's never been legal to park in the grass, but because the area was basically abandoned, nobody was there, so we could do whatever we wanted. But now that they've built houses in the area, and there's a playground there, whereas before we would hold summer events for the neighborhood and the children, so we would encamp the park and the community. But now that gentrification has come, it's put a damper on the activities that we provided to the community.
I hear you. I hear you. So,
Okay.
but as long as you were established under the regulations, got the required permitting, you would be able to continue to operate.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. We had one question submitted during registration and just want to get that out in the open. Less of a question, more of a statement, but the person said that they were interested in the use regulations related to quarry operations. So maybe just we could just offer a brief overview of what those use regulations look like for quarries. That could be helpful.
Sure, and I won't read through them, but just reference that is in the use section of the UDO. And I think it's ML2 is the district where quarries are allowed. And on page 15-42, there are prescribed conditions for quarries. And I believe you have to have a conditional zoning to allow quarries.
And Laura, this is Kevin, and I'm just going to piggyback on what you're saying, and I'd welcome Arista, our consultant on the project, to chime in as necessary. But with regard also to that information, the approach with regard to the regulations or the prescribed conditions and permissions for where quarries can be really have been carried over from our current approach in the zoning ordinance.
Thank you, Kevin. Good point.
Yeah, Kevin, I was about to say the same thing, that we base them on what's in the current ordinance.
If there are any other questions, feel free to ask them now or drop them in the chat. I'm also going to go ahead and put our public comment portal link in there for anyone who would like to submit comments and read the draft. And I'll also put the link for our upcoming engagement. So that's in the chat as well. And if I'm not seeing anything else come in, so thank you all for being here. We really appreciate it. Again, our public comment portal closes on June 30th. So feel free to leave your comments there. We appreciate it. Thank you.